Creators aren't getting paid. That's because powerful corporations have figured out how to create choke points that let them snatch up most of the value generated by creative work before it reaches creative workers. I'm Cory Doctorow.
And I'm Rebecca Giblin.
Our new book, Chokepoint Capitalism, pulls aside the veil on the tricks big tech and big content use to lock in users and suppliers, eliminate competition, and ultimately shake down creators and producers.
We also share tons of ideas for how we can recapture creative labour markets to make them fairer and more sustainable. Margaret Atwood says, we tell how the vampires crashed the party and provide protective garlic. But don't take her word for it. Check out our extended video or read the book for more.
Hi there. Hi. Nice to see you all. We got Rebecca. I think we will have Rebecca shortly. Well, she'll be along shortly. She's beaming in from Australia. The internet takes a long time to reach here from there. So, hi, I'm Cory. It's lovely to be back at Republic. I'm very honored to be here again. I apologize, as I do every year when I come here, for A, not speaking German, and B, having drunk so much coffee that I will end up speaking very quickly. If I do that, just wave and I'll slow down. So a thing that can't have escaped your notice is that over the last decade, the internet has turned into 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. It's gotten noticeably worse year after year, and it's a process that I call Enshittification. The internet just keeps getting shittier. And the reason it's getting shittier is because there's a life cycle that attends digital platforms when they are not disciplined by regulation or by competition. Once they become monopolized, they're free to act in ways that are extremely harmful to their stakeholders and then ultimately to themselves. So here's how that life cycle goes. When a platform starts, it offers all kinds of goodies to end users to bring them in. Uber gave you cheap rides. Facebook gave you a feed with just your friends in it. Google gave you the best search results it could find. And it waits until you are locked in some way so that you can't leave. All your friends are on Facebook. You may not like Facebook, but you like your friends, so you can't leave. All the shops in your neighborhood have closed, and so you have to keep shopping on Amazon. All the taxis went out of business, so you have to keep riding in Uber. Once the end users are locked into the platform, some of the goodness that was given to the end users is taken away and given to the business customers that the platform also relies on. Publishers get a good deal on Facebook, and so do advertisers. Third-party vendors get a really good deal from Amazon, and so on and so on. Once those vendors are locked in, once they can't go anywhere else, then all of the goodies that were given to bring in those third-party vendors, they're taken away from them too. And all of the value in the service, except for that residue that's needed to keep end users and business customers locked in and locked into each other, all of that surplus is withdrawn, and it's given to the platform's shareholders. And the platform becomes something that is barely usable, but strangely compelling, something you can't find yourself leaving, despite the fact that you hate it there. And this is a very brittle equilibrium. It's very hard for platforms to suck almost all of the value out without sucking out so much that people start leaving. And when they hit some kind of exogenous shock, some outside force that tips them out of equilibrium, then they turn into a pile of shit. And so we see that, for example, with Facebook deciding that from now on our destiny is to be legless, sexless, low-polygon cartoon characters in a virtual world named after an idea from a satirical science fiction novel published in the last millennium. You see it with Google deciding that from now on the problem with search will be resolved by having all of our questions answered in the form of extremely long, florid paragraphs composed by a script that doesn't know when it's lying. And we see it in platforms today that are withdrawing surplus in extremely rapid ways, seemingly in a bet that we just won't go anywhere else. So you may have seen the news just this week that Twitch has altered the terms for its performers so that it's much harder for them to monetize their performance using outside vendors. So they're going to be driven into monetizing through Twitch. And of course, Twitch takes a very large percentage of the money that you get from Twitch. So they've just basically turned off the outside money spigot so that all the money flows through Twitch so that they can take that money and put it in their own pocket. This is also happening with Reddit. Reddit is about to have its public offering, and it needs to improve its cash basis. And so in order to do that, it wants to start charging gigantic amounts of money for its APIs. Now, some of the users of those APIs, they're commercial entities doing commercial things. They're doing analytics for marketing, say. But a substantial plurality of the users of those APIs make the moderation tools that allow the volunteers who keep Reddit running to do their job. And the volunteer moderators have announced that starting next week, they're going to black out every popular subreddit on Reddit. And I've been told by a reliable internal source that Reddit has informed those volunteers that if they go through with it, they will be kicked off the platform forever, and everything they've posted will be permanently deleted. We'll see how that goes. So this enshittification, it's part of a wider trend to corporate concentration. And corporate concentration is not limited to the tech sector. Corporate concentration is in every sector. The arts now consists of 5 giant publishers, 4 giant movie studios, 3 giant record labels, 2 giant ad tech companies, and 1 company that sells all the ebooks and the audiobooks. And so concentration, when it occurs, produces these things we call choke points, where a small number of firms are necessary for a creator or someone who assists a creator, like a publisher or a label or a studio, to reach their audiences. They lock the audience in, and then as the creators seek to go to market with their work, they take as much value from the creators as they can, leaving the smallest residue that is necessary to keep those creators coming back for more, which turns out to be a very small residue indeed. Now, this corporate concentration is the result of some policy choices that were taken 40 years ago at the start of the neoliberal era. Particularly, it was the decision to no longer prevent monopolies as bad unto themselves, as a source of power that makes corporations both too big to fail and too big to jail, and rather to operate from the assumption that if a company is able to secure a monopoly, it must be doing something very efficient. And we should just get out of the way, because those efficiencies will eventually trickle down to consumers, who will enjoy better prices, more selection, and so on. One consequence of this model for enforcing competition law is that so long as prices are being suppressed for consumers, firms are generally immune to any kind of competition enforcement. And so they're free to do things like acquire their rivals, engage in predatory pricing, use other anti-competitive tactics to build and maintain a monopoly. And that begets a very specific arrangement. That arrangement is something we call monopsony. Monopsony is a term that nobody knows because nobody ever made a family-destroying board game called monopsony. But monopsony is the little brother of monopoly. A monopoly is a market where you have a very powerful seller. A monopsony is a market where you have a very powerful buyer. And monopsonies characterize all of the arts markets. Right? You have a small number of publishers, a small number of distributors, a small number of labels, a small number of studios, and they have a buyer's market for the creative labor of the workers who produce the work that produces their wealth. Monopsonies are now everywhere we look, but especially in markets where workers feel a sense of satisfaction from what they do, or a sense of duty or mission, a sense of what's sometimes called vocational awe. And in those markets, you can squeeze workers really hard, and they'll keep working. Nurses will show up for work even if they're not getting paid enough to eat because they don't want to leave their patients in their bed. And of course, artists will keep making art until you break their fingers. And so we end up with a lot of art being made even under the most unfavorable conditions. And that's how we came to write Chokepoint Capitalism, to try and resolve some of those conundrums. And I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca. The internet has finally reached here from Australia. And Rebecca is going to give you the next part of our talk. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Corey. Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me okay?
All right. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. Berlin is my spiritual home, so it was very, very tempting. But I already had to be there in a couple of weeks for something I'm doing for Communia and Wikimedia. So I'm afraid you do get my very slow Australian internet instead. We had to write this book a bit for the same reasons. We talk about artists making art until you have to break their fingers. Some of you in the room will know about that feeling where you have to tell a story, and until you tell that story, you just can't rest. This was one of those stories. We started thinking about it when we started talking about it together in February 2018, when we realized that we had this shared frustration that we had been deep in the trenches of the copyright wars for a couple of years, caring very much about how we could do a better job of achieving copyright's twin aims, recognizing and rewarding creators, and also ensuring the widest possible access to knowledge and culture, but being told that no, we have to pick a side. You have to choose one or the other, right? And you have to ignore the collateral damage that comes with that side, right? We're like, well, whether you choose big tech or big content, the outcome's going to be exactly the same. We're going to be settling for the crumbs from the table. And we kept getting told, if you really care about the artists, the solution is more copyright. But we were like, give more copyright is like giving kids who are being shaken down at the school gate for their lunch money more lunch money. It doesn't matter how much lunch money you give them, they're still going to be going hungry.
Hey, Rebecca,
so we wanted to...
Rebecca, we're getting a lot of crackle off your mic. I'm not sure what's going on. It's a little hard to make you out. Try saying a few things now.
That's deeply unpleasant. And as always, we test it and it works perfectly. What if I'm a bit closer?
No, that's worse. You guys are hearing that crackle too, right? Are we okay? Can you guys understand what's being said? Is that okay? Okay, we're all good. I'm sorry, Rebecca. I didn't mean to halt you there.
Let me try a different mic. What do people think? I don't want it to be too painful.
We're getting, it's worse now. Sorry.
All right. No. Good.
Maybe I can pick it up for you for a bit. Do you have another mic you can switch to?
You pick it up. I've got your Yeti here, Corey.
Yeah, we're losing you, Rebecca. That's not good. Do we want to reconnect her? Yeah, Rebecca, we're going to reconnect you. Can you drop off and reconnect? And I'll tell a little more of the story while you're doing that. I don't even know if you can hear me. You know, when I get frozen on Zoom, my mouth is always open. This is how a professional gets frozen on Zoom. So as Rebecca was saying, we both have spent decades fighting about copyright, and we were sick of it. It's so awful to be told that you either have to choose team tech and be on the side of the user, or team content and be on the side of the artist. When, of course, team tech is on the side of tech shareholders, and team content is on the side of entertainment industry shareholders. Doesn't matter which side you pick, the shareholders win. For 40 years, we've made copyright last longer. We've made it cover more kinds of work. We've made the penalties for infringing copyright much higher, and we've made it easier to secure those penalties. And the companies involved have gotten much richer and larger over that time. For example, 3 companies now control all the music. Sony, Warner, Universal, 70% of all the music copyrights, 65% of all the compositions. And so we asked ourselves, how is it possible that we have more copyright, these firms are more profitable, and yet the share of income going to artists is only going down? And I will hand it back to Rebecca. Can we get her on the screen? Maybe?
Am I here?
Maybe. There we are. Hi, Rebecca. So I was about to deliver that schoolyard punchline. Why don't you give us the punchline? We'll take it from there.
Oh, no. Come on. You've done the whole setup, and then I'll jump in.
OK. So we decided, we concluded that giving an artist who's bargaining in a market where there's only 3 labels or 4 studios or 5 publishers or 2 ad tech companies, giving that artist more copyright to bargain with is like giving your bullied school kid extra lunch money. There isn't an amount of lunch money you can give that kid that will satisfy the bullies. The more money you give that kid, the more money the bullies get, and eventually they'll use some of that money to run an international campaign saying, think of the hungry school children, they need more lunch money. And so we needed another approach. Thank you. So take it away, Rebecca.
So we thought, and I really hope you can hear me now,
We
thought that the problem here was actually bigness, right? Specifically, the kind of corporate bigness whose mission is to transfer wealth from workers to investors. And they've got really, really good at it, right? It's like about capitalism, but competition is supposed to be fundamental to it, right? You're supposed to have a free exchange between buyers and sellers. We've seen over the last 40 years is this project aimed at eliminating competition, right? And they even say the quiet parts out loud, right? Peter Thiel, competition is for losers. Warren Buffett, salivating over companies that had sustainable moats, by which he means barriers to entry, right? We're told that when a company gets big, that it creates a temporary advantage that's going to be competed away. But the project is to prevent that competition from actually happening, right? And so what we have seen, and we see it particularly sharply in creative labor markets, is they're being distorted into these hourglass shapes, right? You've got audiences at one end and creators at the other, and these predatory corporations squatting at the neck where they're extracting more and more value. And so Corey, at the beginning of his say, unpacked the playbook for this. What we discovered when we sat down and we started to write this book, and a part that I mentioned before that you might because of the audio quality, is that this is an example of one of those things that we had to do. This was a story that we really had to tell. Is that the playbook is exactly the same across all of these different industries. We knew when we started out that things were bad, but it wasn't until we started unpacking industry after industry we realized just how bad it had got. But even though the playbook is the same, the tools that are used to achieve choke points across different creative industries are a little bit different. And so I want to just mention a few of those to get you thinking about how they work, and also to help spot them in other kinds of use cases. Because we talk about creative workers being the canaries in the coal mine, but markets are being choke pointed in a whole range of different areas. And we've heard from an amazing range of people since the book came out. I think it was probably the comms that we got from a guy who said, "Thank you so much for writing this book. It's exactly the same as what's happening in my field, which is the global market for ornamental plants." Right, so big plant is choke pointed as well. But what are the tools that are actually used to achieve this? All right, let's think about the ebook and audiobook markets, which are sewn up by Amazon and the Amazon-owned Audible in English language markets at least. To start with, digital rights management is a big tool used to keep people locked in to these markets, keep consumers locked in. Digital rights management was promised to be something that protected copyright owners. But in fact, once you start locking things in digital locks that can only be unlocked by the person who put them on, they're not necessarily protecting the copyright owners at all. And in this case, they're protecting Amazon. It promised when it bought Audible that it would take the mandatory DRM off if enough people complained about it. Done that, right? They've refused to do so. And the reason why they do that is because they know people don't want to migrate their libraries over to other platforms. They don't want to separate, they can't migrate their libraries over because they're wrapped in DRM. They don't want to break their libraries up. And so this is a really good way to keep them in their platform. Another technique that they used to keep people locked in the case of Audible, was their extraordinarily generous returns policy. And if you're an Audible subscriber, you might have noticed that you might get a prompt once you finish listening to a book saying, do you want to return this? Or you might have seen that in the newsletters they send out or ads for the service, advertising this no questions asked returns policy, even up to a year after you've bought the book, even if you've listened to it. Well, what was that about? that was only offered to ongoing subscribers of the service. So it was a way to get people to keep paying their monthly fee for that subscription credit. And the thing is, Audible doesn't care about how that money is divided up, right? They just care about keeping people locked into the platform and other audiobook platforms from appearing. So what not have known if you saw this and finding your audiobooks and you thought, this is great, it's like a library service, is that independent authors and smaller publishers who used Audible's ACX platform were paying for you to do that, because Audible was clawing back the royalties every time somebody returned a book, even if they had listened to it and even if they were happy about it. And they knew that this was dodgy, and so they hid it. Lack of transparency. They would only report to these authors net sales, which were sales after returns had come out, right? And authors were badgering them to say, well, how many people are returning our books? And they weren't able to get kind of any answers on that. And the only reason that the extent of this scam came because there was a data glitch one day, and 3 weeks of returns showed up in a single day. And suddenly some authors were like, what do you mean I had minus 1,000 sales today, right? And that transparency is what allowed them to organize and do something about that. Amazon's Prime program also really designed at getting their customers locked in. But then if we start looking to other markets, we can see the different kinds of tools that are used. So in recorded music, for example, we've got 3 record labels that control almost 70% of the global recorded music market. And they own 3 music publishers that control almost 60% of global song rights. And because they take, and they're able to take in most countries, copyrights for the entire term of copyright, which in the case of song rights can be over a century, sort of close to a century for the record in some countries, right? They've created this industrial aggregation of copyrights that they can use future of music markets in ways that benefit their executives and their investors over the artists that they are supposed to represent, right? And so we all hear the complaints about streaming and how low the cents per stream are and how badly most creators do out of that. But what fewer people realize is that the global streaming market was created by the majors for the majors, right? So in that case, the choke points very much come around from those industrial aggregations of copyright. Then when we look at streaming itself, the music streaming industry, why do we have so few music streaming platforms? We've got Spotify and Deezer, and then a handful that are controlled by big tech. But there's tons of people that really care about music. They're passionate about finding ways of getting creators paid. They've got lots of ideas, lots of technical nous. Why are they not? Well, there's a bunch of reasons behind that, including the fact that the copyrights are controlled by those major labels for the most part, and that you can't create an alternative without getting them to agree, right? And how do you get them to agree to a system that's going to do worse for them and better for artists? They're probably not going to. But we can also see that there are real barriers to entering into these markets. So it's hugely, the licensing arrangements are hugely complex. And so the startup costs and administration costs of running a music streaming platform are really high. Now, we could have fixed this, right? When Napster was started, we could have said, okay, people really want access to all of the world's music very simply. Let's make licensing work. Let's get people paying for this. But we didn't do that, right? And we're paying for that now. Another way that the streaming platforms like Spotify lock us in is through playlistification, right? There's those playlists, the algorithm tells us to, and sometimes it's got really good suggestions, right? And sometimes they're less good. But what the playlists are doing is training us to outsource to companies like Spotify the decisions about what to put into our ears. They're trying to disintermediate artists from the equation, right? And once they've done that, once they've got the power to do that, then they're doing things like what we're already seeing play out in real time, where they've got programs that say to artists, okay, well, you really want to make it onto a playlist, right? You really want to be one of those few that make it big and that actually do make some money from streaming, that can have a music career. But we know you don't have any money. So what if we offer you lower royalties still for a greater chance of making it onto a playlist? And from there, it's a race onto the bottom.
Hey, Rebecca, we probably need to move on to the close now. We're at time here.
Yeah. Okay. So what I wanted to say is that this is not one of those chapter 11 books, right? We spoke a lot about the problems, but we really, in the whole second half, that's all about the solutions, right? The things that there's a whole bunch of things that don't work very well in response to monopsony, but there is a few interventions that we know do work, and like encouraging new entrants into the market, directly regulating excessive buyer power, and building countervailing power in workers and suppliers. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that during the Q&A.
Sure. So I'll just wind us up here and conclude it by saying, as Rebecca said, the first half of this book is devoted to these very detailed dissections of how the accounting scams work in different sectors. And we've heard from a lot of readers that they get very angry by the end of the first half. They hear a high-pitched whining noise that's like an incipient aneurysm. They want to throw the book. And we tell readers to hang in there, because the second half of the book, as Rebecca says, is solutions, technical solutions for how we unwind these markets. So for example, if you have a royalty-generating contract for music or movies or books, you're entitled to audit those royalties. And when you do, you will find discrepancies. And for reasons I don't understand, when there's a discrepancy in royalties, it's never in the artist's favor. We cite one company in Los Angeles that spent decades auditing tens of thousands of record contracts. And in all those times, they've only found one instance where the artist benefited from the error. And in every other instance, the label did. We can only assume that this is some kind of horrible, localized probability storm that makes things very hard for their accountants. So if you say to them, "You stole my money, give it back to me," they'll say, "Artists, you're adorable, but you can't do math. We don't owe you anything, and you can't afford to sue us. But I'll tell you what, we're such nice guys. We'll pay you half of what you think we owe you. You just have to sign a non-disclosure deal that says that you will never tell anyone else how we stole the money from you, which might show them how we're stealing money from them." Now, those contracts, because of monopoly, they're all settled in 4 states. New York and California, of course, Washington State, because that's where the video games and Amazon are, and Tennessee, because of Nashville. And the contracts are a matter of state law. State law is much easier to amend than federal laws in the United States. If we were to amend the contract law of any one or all of those 4 states to say non-disclosure cannot be enforced when it pertains to omissions or misstatements in royalty statements that steal wages from creators, then at the stroke of a pen, we put more money into the pockets of more artists than 40 years of term extensions and copyright combined. Money talks and bullshit walks. This is a crack in the machine. We stick a crowbar in it, we shake it around, and money pours out into artists' pockets. It's not the right to be angry at your audience for listening to your songs the wrong way. It's the right to pay your mortgage and put your kid through college. So people ask us these technical ideas that you establish in the book, how are you going to get them into the world? And for this, we borrow some praxis from our arch enemy, a guy named Milton Friedman. Everybody should have an arch enemy. He's a pretty good one to have. Milton Friedman is the architect of neoliberalism. And when he was cooking up his terrible ideas in the 1960s and 70s, ideas that would roll back the post-war prosperity that so many people were sharing in and bring us back to a new feudal age, people said, "Milton, how are you going to get these ideas from out there into government? Nobody likes these ideas. People like having health care and a place to live and social mobility for their children." And he said, "I'll tell you what, there will eventually be a crisis. And when the crisis strikes, ideas that are lying around can move from the periphery to the center in an eye blink." So that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to create ideas lying around because we are having crises in the arts. Anything that can't go on forever will eventually stop. And we have lurched from crisis to crisis to crisis as we've allowed these firms to enshittify, to concentrate, to exploit, to choke point. And because we haven't had good ideas lying around, every time we've hit a crisis, we've said, let's just do what we did last time, but try harder and see if we get a different outcome. That hasn't worked. So I'm going to leave you with that thought, that as we are approaching more crises, we are in a position to try something new, something that will work, as opposed to just something that we can think of because we've tried it before. And when we do, we'll have allies, because we're not the only ones as creative workers who suffer from monopoly. Monopoly is everywhere, and it hurts all kinds of workers, and it hurts all kinds of consumers as well. One company owns every eyeglass brand you've ever heard of, as well as all the high street retailers and the people who make all the lenses, and the insurer that insures all the eyewear in the world. One company called Luxottica Essilor, they've raised the prices of glasses 1,000% in the last decade. They stole your eyes. Right? Everyone who wears glasses is on our side and they don't know it. Everyone who drinks beer is on our side and they don't know it. 2 beer companies. Everyone who ships things, 3 shipping cartels, is on our side. Finance, you name it, it's all concentrated. James Boyle says that before the term ecology was coined, people didn't know they were on the same side. You care about owls, I care about the ozone layer. Do we care about the same thing? Once we have the term ecology, we understand that all these issues are part of one movement. There is a movement brewing to fight corporate concentration and the power and impunity that comes with it. And that's how artists are going to get paid. So now I think we're going to move to our Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Corey. Thank you so much, Rebecca, first of all, for being here with us at Republica, but of course for writing this really important book. I think, also, I said this to you briefly before you went on stage. On a personal note, I come from a family of musicians and artists, and we have been torn apart by debates around copyright, when in fact we should be sitting on the same side of the table in terms of advocacy. People have been advocating for rights for creative workers, and digital freedom should definitely be united in this. So thanks so much for this really important book. I am feeling very lucky that I have the chance to talk to you both about it. I want to ask 1 or 2 questions on the first part, but then really focus on some of the solutions that you offer that you just sketched out briefly now. So maybe to begin with, lots to talk about. These monopolies, these choke points are leading to the effects that you outlined. They're also leading to they are also having an effect on how art is created. For instance, how Spotify adds to how music is made, what kind of works with their algorithms, etc. But these choke points, these monopolistic structures, are also creating political effects. And that's been true since even before big tech. You give a great example because of the concentration of the radio industry, for instance, in the US, how this hit the Dixie Chicks way before the social media world that we live in now. But you also talk about app stores in your book, and why these app stores are in themselves choke points by not only creating these walled gardens and taking huge cuts of money, but also, of course, by politically curating spaces. Could you both talk a little bit about that, please?
Rebecca, do you want to start, or are you frozen? I think Rebecca's frozen. All right, I'll start. We'll get Rebecca back on the line. So you make a good point. This shift in the way that we think about competition had a profound consequence. 40 years ago, we had the idea that if we allowed firms to become large enough, that they would become gatekeepers that were too big to fail and too big to jail, that they would become uncontrollable entities that were able to overwhelm the democratic will of the people and do as they would. And one of the ways that affects us in the arts is by concentrating decision-making about who gets heard. And we see this with app stores. Apple has this argument that if you're only allowed to install software that they have deemed fit for your use, that they will protect you from yourself. They'll protect you from your naivete, your inability to sort good apps from bad, and that this will serve you. But what we see is that the temptation to use that control, which is backstopped by law and technology. It's against the law to reverse engineer an iPhone to add another app store. Our Article 6 of the Copyright Directive of 2001 makes it a crime to reverse engineer an iPhone and allow the owner of that iPhone to install another app store and run software they're choosing. So on the one hand, we see these firms making arbitrary decisions about what people can and can't see based on their own business interests. So in China, Apple took away all of the privacy tools from the App Store because the Chinese government said, if you want to continue reaching Chinese consumers and if you want to continue having access to Chinese manufacturing, you must do this. Closer to home, Apple reaches into the market for media, and they say, yeah, there's going to be alternatives to our App Store, our bookstore, our music store, and so on, but they're going to have to pay us 30% commissions on every sale they make, whereas we're going to be able to sell the same works without paying those commissions. So imagine if you had two businesses next to each other, one of which took 30% of its profits and handed it to the other business every time it made a sale. You can see where that market ends up every time. And so what you end up with ultimately is Apple being the only entity that can sell books. They end up running the show. So this has really profound cultural impacts as well. Now, the Digital Markets Act, the European Commission finalized and the Parliament voted in, will force App Store competition. And I think that's going to make a really big difference. We have a lot of talk today about how we're going to save another kind of creative worker, the journalist. And all of our talks so far about saving journalists has focused on doing what they did here in Germany, which is asking the tech platforms to profit share with the journalists, which makes them partners with them. The idea here is that somehow if you have a search engine that indexes the news or a social media platform where people are allowed to talk to the news, that's somehow stealing the news. Having an index of the news, letting people talk about the news, that's not stealing the news. If you're not allowed to talk about the news, it's not the news, it's a secret. But they do steal something from the news. What they steal is money, right? They steal 30% of every subscriber euro. They steal 51% of every advertising euro. And if we make the media partners with tech, then they're not going to be watchdogs for tech. They won't be making sure that tech stays honest. If, on the other hand, we make tech stop stealing money from the news, then the news is going to be able to run its own show and not rely on tech for its money. They're going to be able to get the money that they deserve.
Yeah, it's a good example that you chose. It's a debate I have often with Marcus, one of the founders of Republica, how a lot of the digital rights activist groups back then were sort of blinded and lobbied by big tech really to be on the wrong side of the discussion when that was first introduced, but have come to see over the years that, and I think this is a good point that you make in the very beginning of the book, that we weren't focusing on the bigness back then, you know? Yeah. We were maybe focusing on the fear of censorship, the other topics that were big on the agenda, but we weren't focusing on the bigness back then. We hadn't shifted that view there.
I think that, 40 years ago, or 20 years ago, what tech people like me missed wasn't that technology could be a force for ill. Nobody founds an organization like Netzpolitik or the Electronic Frontier Foundation because you think everything is going to be fine, right? People don't read Cyberpunk and go, oh, that sounds great. There is always this sense that technology could become a force for control, for censorship, for manipulation and extraction. What I think we didn't understand was that the era in which technology was dynamic and competitive was coming to an end because of this big shift in how we enforced competition law, which allowed for a new kind of firm that we never saw before. I mean, you think about, I used to work for Silicon Graphics. I was a Silicon Graphics integrator. That's a company that doesn't even exist anymore, right? Nobody even remembers it anymore. And when I was working for them, they bought Cray, which was another company that doesn't exist anymore. They made computers that were so big, they were famous because the furniture that they built into the computers was very comfortable, right? This used to be a fitness factor for a computer vendor. How comfortable is it to sit on the computer, right? And at a certain point, we stopped having that turnover, and it's not because the people involved made better computers. And it's not because they were greedier. Believe me, the people who started Silicon Graphics were terrible people and very greedy, right? The difference is we let them do something different. We let them buy all their competitors. And so we got companies like Google. Google is a company that made one successful product. They made a very, very good search engine. And then they made a pretty good Hotmail clone. And then they took some old Safari code and they made a good browser. And then they made a bunch of products that failed, a video product, an ad product, and so on. But they bought other people's successful products. They bought an ad stack. They bought a video stack. They bought server management, documents, calendaring, maps, satellite tools from other people who had good ideas. Google likes to call itself, the idea factory. They're like Willy Wonka. But what they really are is they're Uncle Pennybags from Monopoly. They just buy everyone who's got a good idea. And it's a place where good ideas go to die, right? Like Yahoo was, like Facebook is, like Apple is. Apple buys 90 companies a year. Apple goes shopping for companies more often than you and I go shopping for groceries, right? These companies are not technically excellent. They are merely financially deep-pocketed. Yes, they're good at operating firms, but they're not good at starting things. They're not good at innovating.
Basically vacuuming up all the content, people creating the value that is being created elsewhere.
And so we missed that we would end up in this world of 5 giant tech companies that would then end up in these public-private partnerships from hell with the government, right? Where we say, oh, I'm not worried about government surveillance, I'm worried about corporate surveillance. I'm not worried about corporate surveillance, I'm worried about government surveillance. There's no difference. The reason that we're not enforcing the GDPR is because the police like to go to Google and ask them for their surveillance data. If we make them stop collecting the data, then where would the police be?
Which is why it's specifically interesting, all the choke points that you point to in your book are super interesting. But one that also really got my attention is when you talk about advertising, the core business model of Google, Facebook, and these two of these big 5, and explain how most of the ads on the internet are overvalued and underperforming, and that it might not be as difficult or impossible as we think to also target some of these choke points.
Yeah, the story of ad tech is that on the one hand, that the 2 big ad tech platforms, Meta and Google, that they are capable of superhuman acts of neutrality. So Google and Facebook, they run the sell side, so they represent the publishers. They run the buy side, they represent the advertisers. And then they run the marketplace, where the advertisers and the publishers meet to buy and sell advertising space. And they say, we are being an honest representative of the marketplace, of the buyer and the seller, even though if we were to cheat, we could make a lot of money by doing things worse for all of those people. And they also say that the reason that 51 euro cents out of every euro that is spent on advertising goes into their pocket is not because they're cheating, it's because they're doing a very good job, right? This is amazing, because the people who say this, these corporate officers, they're lawyers. And if they were to ever represent a client in front of a judge who was the brother-in-law of the person that was suing them, they would say to the judge, I'm sorry, you can't be the judge, right? If they were getting a divorce and they and their partner met with a lawyer who said, I can represent both of you, it's fine, they would say, no, we need 2 separate lawyers who are adverse to each other. But when it's themselves representing these contradictory interests, they say that it's just them. And so 51 cents out of every euro goes into their pockets. Now, there are lots of ways that we could unrig these advertising markets. We could force these companies to separate. We could say you can represent the buyer, the seller, or the marketplace, but not all 3. And we could finally enforce the GDPR. And we could say, look, nobody wants to be spied on. There is no legitimate purpose in spying on people. There is no consent for spying on people. And so we're going to have to get rid of all of these surveillance ads where you go and you search for shoes, and then for a week, everywhere you look on the internet, it's shoe ads. And instead, you're going to have to start selling contextual ads, where what you know about the user is what they're reading or what they're looking at. And instead of going to the marketplace and you say, I have here a 28-year-old young man from Berlin who's been searching for information about gonorrhea and is recently visited a hospital. Instead, you say, I have a phone in Berlin and they're reading an article about tennis. Who would like to advertise to them? Now, the publishers are always going to know more about their content than the surveillance companies will, right? Now, the surveillance companies are always going to know more about your readers than the publishers will. And so if we want to put the publishers back in control so that they're not giving 30% to the apps, so they're not giving 51% to the ads, so that they're getting the money that they're owed, we can clean up the ad markets.
Fantastic. And I think it's so great that you point out in so many parts of the book what we can actually change and where to start thinking about, getting active in that direction and sort of uniting forces. So I want to get to some of those solutions that you sketch out, and I want to invite a little sort of mind opening, because you end one chapter saying how much worse it would be if we don't manage to break these choke points. But let's try to imagine a bit how much better it could be if we do. Because I feel, and this is something I was talking about yesterday with our Minister of Culture, we're missing out on so much cultural space on the internet. There's so many unfilled opportunities. And you hint this in your book as well, like the live stream in the clubs during Corona in Berlin. That was maybe one of those little glimpses of how what decentralized or more pluralistic cultural spaces could look like, connecting little galleries, connecting little concerts, school plays. Let's have a little visioning, what could our creative cultural spaces look like if we liberated ourselves from these choke points?
Well, look, the people who use technology are always going to know more about their lives than the people who design it. And the people who design it might know more about technology itself, but they don't know more about how you need to use it. In the disability movement, there's this saying, nothing about us without us, right? And when we see disability adaptation in technology, it's kind of a good example of how you can be very thoughtful and you can try and design things in ways that allow people with disabilities to adapt technology to their needs, but you can never be complete, right? That there are always going to be adaptations that users at the periphery want to make that are specific to their own life circumstances. So you may know about how you may know about how a school play should be live streamed or a rural gallery should be live streamed or what have you, but for so long as the people at the edge aren't allowed to adapt the technology themselves, for so long as vendors, right, whether that's a cooperative or an SME or a startup or just a rival, aren't allowed to adapt existing technology, reverse engineer it, reconfigure it, scrape it and repackage it, then those adaptations that are necessary in order to give people the technological self-determination they deserve, that allow them to make the technology work in their own life circumstances, that are distinct from the way that other people want them to work, then we will never really realize the potential of technology, both as a force for culture and for human liberation.
Yeah, absolutely. So the former government, there was this term they used to love using, Alternativlosigkeit. It's the German word meaning that there's no viable alternative to the current system in place. And I feel like big tech has made us believe that is true also for the way that the internet looks today. And you make such a great point out of the fact that that is not true. There is a very different internet possible. And one technical key to that is interoperability. And in the chapter about interoperability, you go into different aspects of that. Adversarial interoperability, a concept you call competitive compatibility, and mandated interoperability. I think this is really important. It's really key. So I'd love to invite you to just explain these concepts.
Sure. So interoperability at its root is the idea that you can plug one thing into something else, right? The person who sells you the pencil doesn't get to tell you whose pencil sharpener you're going to use. The person who sells you socks doesn't get to tell you whose shoes to wear. And the person who sells you a computer doesn't get to tell you which software you get to run or what peripherals you can plug into it. And interoperability, it's latent in our technology. We really only know how to make one computer, right? The Turing-complete von Neumann machine. It's a computer that can run every program that we know how to write. There is no technical way to stop someone from adapting a computer to do something the manufacturer didn't intend. But we have laws that stand in the way of doing it. We have anti-circumvention, we have contract, patent, we have lots of exotic theories about API copyrights and so on that get in the way of people adapting technology in ways that suit them. So one way to address this is we can mandate that companies add interoperability, right? We can say to companies, you must permit third parties to connect. You have to have an API, or you have to have a standard interface so that other people can add things. And that would be pretty exciting. I mean, you're stuck on Facebook because your friends are on Facebook. They're stuck on Facebook because you're on Facebook, right? It's a mutual hostage taking. What if you could leave Facebook, go somewhere else, but continue to send messages back to Facebook? Just like you can switch from one phone carrier to another and continue to talk to your old friends. Well, maybe we could force Facebook to enable that facility in its technology. But in addition to this, we also need to allow new market entrants, and users themselves to adapt the technology in the way I was just describing, this adversarial interoperability, where you get to modify the technology even if the company that is modifying it doesn't want you to, and even if they try and stop you from doing it. So for example, in the early 2000s, Apple almost went extinct. Microsoft had leveraged its monopoly over Office software, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. They had stopped supporting the Mac version. It was very, very bad. And so if you were in an Office environment, you really had to have a PC on your desk to talk to all the Windows users in your office. So even if you were a designer who had a Mac, you had a PC next to it. And the next stage in that was that you just put a big graphics card in your PC and threw away the Mac. And Apple knew that this was going to be their death. And what they didn't do was beg Bill Gates to make a better version of Office for the Mac. Instead, Steve Jobs had some of his technologists reverse engineer the Microsoft file formats. And they made iWork, Pages, Numbers, and Keynote, so that anyone could use a Mac and send documents back and forth to people who had PCs. This saved Apple. Right, and it is still in use today, and the result of that are standards-based Office formats that allow Google Docs and so on. This is adversarial interoperability, and the irony is that if you were to do this to Apple today, like if you were to make an emulator so that you could run Mac or iPhone software on Android, Apple would reduce you to radioactive rubble, right? They would say that you were circumventing, that you were engaged in tortious interference with contract, that you were violating cybersecurity, that you were violating their patents, and so on and so on. Right? When they do it, it's progress. When you do it, it's piracy. Right? Every pirate wants to be an admiral. Right? That's not unusual. The strange thing is that they got it. So we could, in addition to mandating companies to have interoperability, to allow people to escape, to allow artists to move platforms and take their audiences with them, to block this kind of anti-competitive activity, we could also give back the space that technologists used to have to unilaterally modify things. And Europe is in a very good position for this, because unlike America, you have a privacy law, right?
So you, and it's still mind-blowingly to me, companies like Facebook, I feel, get away with framing interoperability as a security risk. You mentioned the DMA earlier. I feel we need much stronger legislation to enable interoperability concepts, as you just explained. Where do you see hope for this in the European Union?
Well, I mean, the European Union's passage of the DMA, I think, is an amazing thing. It is something that if you'd asked me to put money on, I would have bet it wasn't going to happen, even though I wanted it to. And I think that it represents part of a global groundswell in skepticism of tech's claims that it is the best regulator for itself. You know, it's true, right? Facebook does defend its users against security threats, but only external security threats, right? So Facebook, they do something Bruce Schneier calls feudal security. Feudal security is like you have a warlord, right? And he says, out there are bandits, but if you move into my castle, I will have mercenaries stand on the castle walls, and they'll keep the bandits from coming into the castle and stealing from you. And that works great. But if the Lord decides that he wants to do to you what the bandits would do, then the mercenaries turn around and they keep you from leaving, right? This is like the Watchmen, right? I'm not locked in here with you, you're locked in here with me, right? So it is fine that Facebook defends its users against external threats, and it does, but it is not enough. The same goes for Apple. So, you know, one of the things the ad tech industry likes to say is that people like ads. They like ads, they just don't like them when they're not relevant. And by spying on you, we can show you the good ads, and people consent to it. So Apple, they modified the iPhone so that with one click, you could opt out of being tracked for ads. 96% of iPhone owners clicked that box, right? The other 4% presumably either worked for Facebook or got confused, right? But here's the thing, and Facebook lost $10 billion in a year because of this. It's like 20% of what they wasted building the metaverse. It's a lot of money. But the punchline is that Apple kept spying on you, right? Even if you ticked the "don't spy on me" box, Apple was like, well, you didn't mean us, right? And they spied on you in exactly the same way and for exactly the same purpose. So it's fine for platforms to set the floor on your privacy, but they can't set the ceiling. The ceiling on your privacy needs to come from democratically accountable lawmakers. And one of the questions we need to ask is, why have those lawmakers been so hamstrung in making policy and then in enforcing policy? And I think the answer comes from concentration. Remember that before we revised the anti-monopoly laws in the 80s, we were worried about corporate power per se. That if corporations were too big, they would be too big to fail and too big to jail. That they'd be able to gang up on their regulators. When a regulator asks a question like, can advertising work without spying on people? If all of the advertising is concentrated into 2 or 3 companies, they're all going to show up and say the same thing. No, we can't have advertising without surveillance. Actually, what happened was we started the company, and this bearded prophet came down off a mountain with 2 stone tablets, and he said, Larry, Sergey, stop rotating your log files and start mining them for actionable market intelligence, right? Making a search engine that doesn't spy on you is like making water that isn't wet. And we can show up from civil society, or you can get little SMEs that show up and they say, no, it's bullshit. But they say, well, how big is your business? How many people's search queries do you handle? And they win the argument every time. When we make those companies smaller and weaker, we make it more possible to regulate them, right? It's like the joke goes, if you wanted to start there, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. The fact that these companies are so big makes them hard to regulate, but it means that we must start regulating them. And it's going to have to be an iterative process. Now that we've got the DMA passed, we're going to have to make sure that it's enforced and that we don't get another GDPR situation where one rogue state, Ireland, is able to be a haven, not just for tax evasion, but also for regulatory arbitrage.
Yeah, and making laws and making them implementable, absolutely. So we need to talk about copyright before we get off the stage,
Sure.
of course. Because as we mentioned earlier, conversations that maybe drew apart creative people and people lobbying for creative rights, and us thinking about how to create the internet and free and open a creative place, when really there should have been one conversation. So one concept that you suggest in your book is automatic reversion of copyright after 25 years. Maybe this is also something that brings up some alarm bells for creative, when really it's putting power and control back in their hands. Can you explain why this is a good concept?
Sure. So, in the 1976 Copyright Act, there was a proposal for copyright transfers, right? When you sign a contract that says you now have the rights to this picture I made, the song I recorded, whatever, that after 25 years, those contracts would just end, and the people you sold your work to would have to come back and bargain with you again. Now, every creator likes to think that they've made work for the ages. The reality is that nearly all works stop having a commercial life after about 14 years. We're at like kind of the 98th percentile by the time we get to 14 years. But the works that last for 25 years, they really matter to our cultural conversation. And almost by definition, if you're still alive and you sold some work 25 years ago, you were pretty young when you sold it, and you probably didn't have much bargaining power, right? And so by having this automatic termination, you could go back to people who bargained from a position of strength with you and got 25 years of exploitation out of your work that turned out to be one of those small numbers of works that were very commercially viable over long time scales, and they have to bargain with you again, and you can get a better deal out of it. That was scuttled. It was turned into 30 years and not automatic. It comes with a lot of paperwork burdens, although I'm on the advisory board of a nonprofit called the Authors Alliance that will help you terminate your copyrights. If any of you have signed a literary contract in the United States 30 years ago and would like to claim your copyrights back, if you go to authorsalliance.org, we've got an automated tool for helping claim that back. It's a pity we couldn't get Rebecca on. She texted to say that the tech just failed us, but I assume this is down to ISP monopolies. But Rebecca is the world's leading expert on this. She did a study in which they examined every single copyright termination in American history to see what became of it. And this has been very powerful for all kinds of artists. George Clinton, for example. The reason George Clinton is still out on tour is not because he's an unstoppable funk god, although he is an unstoppable funk god. It's because his manager stole all of his copyrights and forged his signature on an assignment. And he spent 30 years trying to get those copyrights back. But his manager had the revenue from his copyrights to defend himself against the claim that he'd stolen those copyrights. And so he was never able to get the copyrights back. After 30 years, George Clinton just turned around and said, fine, let's stipulate that I did transfer those copyrights to you. They're done. I'm getting my copyrights back. And so this is giving him a retirement. And it's great, and it's well earned. Stephen King got the copyrights to his first half dozen novels back. Women are very prolific users of this. Taylor Swift, this is a slightly different thing. Taylor Swift did something else. She re-recorded her masters. But the woman who wrote the Babysitter's Club books and the woman who wrote the Sweet Valley High books terminated all those copyright transfers. If you got a young person in your life you're buying those books for, you're buying them from the author, and we're getting a better deal. Now again, this is not about making copyright last longer. This is about changing the contours of copyright so that the distributional outcome, how much money goes into whose pocket, changes. That's, I think, the thing we as creators need to be attuned to. More copyright sounds great, but which copyright is the thing we need to pay attention to?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many more great concepts in this book. Luckily, you can get it here at Republica at our book desk, and even luckier that Corey would be signing it for you.
I will make it non-returnable for you.
So you'll have the opportunity to do that directly when we get off the stage here. And I also want to point out that it's super sad that we lost Rebecca. She is going to be in Berlin, and speaking about this book, there's going to be an event at Wikimedia Germany later this month in June, so you'll have the opportunity to meet her then in person. Corey, I have to say, like, the keynote that you gave a number of years ago about DRM and the toaster is still one of my favorite Republica keynotes ever, so it's so fantastic to have you back here on a stage. Let's have a huge round of applause for both you and Rebecca, please.